Yes, we are going to be recording this talk, so you should have that little thing that just popped up so that we can share the talk afterwards with folks who were not able to join us today. So thank you for joining us this evening to hear from our honored award winner, Professor Tatiana Argüello. I should introduce myself. I am Professor Jackson. I'm the new chair of the Women and Gender Studies Department, and I'm very excited about this particular talk because it is one of our signature events. Professor Argüello is the 2021-2022 Women and Gender Studies Claudia V. Camp Faculty Research and Creative Activity Award winner for her work that centers women and gender in her analysis of care, labor, and the communal desire to reproduce life, the instructive example of Indigenous Mayan women, which is what she's going to be speaking to us about this evening. The Camp Award is a one-year honorary appointment that recognizes excellence in scholarship and creative activity by a faculty member at TCU who's affiliated with the Women and Gender Studies Department here at TCU. During the academic year of the award recipient presents one public lecture, which is this, on the work that was recognized by the award. The award is named for one of the founders of what was then called Women's Studies at TCU, Dr. Claudia Camp, who is here with us, and we're very honored to welcome Claudia this evening. Claudia, Dr. Camp, was the John F. Weatherly Professor Emerita of Religion, is the Professor Emerita of Religion at TCU, where she taught from 1980 to 2016. And I have to say, as the incoming chair of WGST and the first, full-time dedicated chair of this department, I really am honored by who is here with us this evening, including Claudia, including other affiliates and folks who have just been instrumental in ensuring that women in gender studies remains constant at TCU. So Dr. Argüello is an assistant professor of Spanish and Hispanic studies at TCU. Her scholarship and teaching focus on the realities of politics and violence of Central America in literature and cinema. That's her focus. So much of her work deals with Central Americans in the United States, modernist and avant-garde poetry, questions of ecology and the non-human, and representations of the most vulnerable communities disproportionately comprised of Black and Indigenous women. She has published her work nationally and internationally in different peer-reviewed journals and academic volumes. And she is currently co-writing a book on re-examining notions of race and gender through ecological thought in the writings of literary and philosophical authors from the Mesoamerican region. So our plan tonight is that Dr. Argüello will speak, and then we will open up to Q&A. So please keep track of your questions and comments and inspirations. And with that, I will say, please join me in welcoming Professor Argüello with a round of celebratory reactions here on our Zoom. And with that, I will hand it over to Tatiana.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I have some acknowledgements that I want to say. First, I would like to thank the Women and Gender Studies Department for giving me the generous opportunity to share my research, particularly to Nino Testa, Joanne Green, the new chair, Crystal Jackson, Dr. Claudia Clamp, the members of the advisory committee, the Women and Gender Studies community at TCU, and thank you everybody for attending my talk today. Second, I want to thank my colleagues at the Department of Spanish and Hispanic Studies for their support and flexibility to allow me to teach a variety of courses about Central America and to bring to light the works of writers, activists, artists from this marginalized region. And last but not least, I want to thank my life and academic partner and a writer who teaches at TCU in the Honors College for motivating me to write about Rigoberta Menchú, an inspiring woman that I have studied and taught in different periods of my life, but I haven't, never wrote about it until now. And my presentation today is part of a larger project that I'm co-writing with Andrew that highlights the contribution to feminist thought made by Central American women. This is the first study to make this contribution to world philosophy, and it is currently under review with Hypatia, a journal of feminist philosophy. So I'm going to share my screen with you all, and we can start. Let me see, 1 second. Okay. 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 The pandemic makes visible the importance of care labor to protect marginalized communities. We witness protests around the world that testify to this. Feminist movements in Latin America against feminicide and state violence, Indigenous ecological activists, Black Lives Matter fighting against police brutality, and immigrant caravans protecting each other while crossing the border. My project follows these lines of thought by emphasizing the contribution to feminist thought in terms of reproductive labor made by a Central American woman who took part in the political and gender struggles. The Guatemalan Mayan Quiche activist and Nobel Peace Prize winner Rigoberta Menchú, born in 1959. Synthesizing socialist ideas with Christian ethics and indigenous values, she advocated different conceptions of labor, ecology, and the value of indigenous cultures. Moving forward, Central American feminist thought presents new proposals for social transformation that promise liberation within an awareness of human immersion in the living earth. This presentation today explores testimonial literature by Menchú and translates her ideas into the language of philosophical claims. Theoretically, I bring Menchú into dialogue with feminist thinkers from different traditions, such as Silvia Federici, an Italian autonomist feminist, and Gladys Ursul, a Guatemalan author of the contemporary generation. From the perspective of global feminism, Central American figures like Menchú are distinguished by their ability to combine egalitarian values with sexual difference, as well as profound experience of mortal danger and the attention to humans' immersion in a greater ecology. Published in 1983, I, Rigoberta Menchú, an Indian woman in Guatemala, the memoir of the Guatemalan Maya Quiche activist and Nobel Peace Prize winner Rigoberta Menchú, has become a classic in many languages, providing a vivid understanding of the lives of poor indigenous women and their struggle against state violence. Death and mourning are integral to Menchú's life and writings, and since most of her family were killed in the genocidal war that lasted 36 years from 1960 to 1996, killing 205,000 civilians. In literature, she has been amply studied through the lens of testimonial narrative that has a political role, revealing the experience of the voiceless people. John Beverly described testimonial as, I quote, a new form of narrative literature in which we can at the same time witness and be part of the emerging culture of an international proletarian popular democratic subject in its period of ascendancy, end of quote. In testimony, the narrator speaks in the name of a community about a situation of urgency. The narrator is usually outside formal education and requires the support of an interlocutor to transcribe the account. Menchú's interlocutor is a Venezuelan anthropologist, Elizabeth Burgos, and in the 90s, Menchú's testimony was involved in an enormous controversy in the US Academy, since anthropologist David Stoll questioned its veracity. My reading of Menchú avoids this controversy because the great majority of her narrative has been confirmed, and I understand the few cases of ambiguity in terms of poetic license. I view Menchú as a distinct and original thinker in the tradition of indigenous feminism. In some respects, she provides a window into the collective experience of her people, but also she presents innovative contributions to global feminism through her autonomous thought and reflection. Menchú testimony articulates embodied feminine experiences from indigenous points of view, These experiences are sometimes a product of her distinct culture and its epistemology, but also marked by the violence of a brutal dictatorship meted out according to ethnic and class hatred. In her memoirs, Menchú demonstrates her participation in life and death, particularly mourning, through her political organization and contribution to communal work. Her social activity connects her to reproductive labor, the natural world, and sharing the individual and communal pain of death. From daily routines, passing on Mayan knowledge to defending their lands and searching for justice against the state, Indigenous women produce and think collectively resilience. I see Menchú's philosophy in light of what Mayan sociologist Gladys Sulzul calls voluntad de vida, desire to live. Sulzul described this, I quote, the social energy that Indigenous women produce that allows them to preserve their memory and defend their land where the dead rests and the water is born, end of quote. She specifies that for the Ixchil community, a component of broader Mayan society to which both Menchú and Sulzul belongs, voluntad de vida is what keeps them struggling and living despite all the problems they face. In the introduction to I, Rigoberta Menchú, an Indian woman in Guatemala, Elizabeth Burgos reflects on the process of transcribing Menchú's testimony during a week she spent in Paris. Burgos describes a scene in which Menchú makes tortilla for her. The first things Rigoberta did when she got up in the morning was make dough and cook tortillas for breakfast. It was a reflex that was thousands of years old, says Burgos. In lines that might be read as patronizing, Burgos affirms that the bond and trust between herself as a mestizo woman and Menchú came from enjoying and sharing the same food. Certainly, there's always camaraderie with food, but Menchú's cooking means sharing her testimony while creating community through serving others. This resonates with the notion of communal work, known as catchcall, which is rooted in indigenous Mayan societies, in which domestic and political life are not fully separated, but one supports the other. The identity and plenitude of the individual emerges from the multiple through communal connections. In many chapters of Menchú's memoirs, she emphasizes being in the world through her community, for her family, and for herself. In her account, Mayan children, since their birth, not only belong to their mothers, but to their communities. Her parents participate in cultivating the land and defending it from expropriation. And Menchú herself became very involved as a catechist and a political leader. Regarding gender dynamics in communal life, there is a strong role of paternal kinship, but the same catchcall opens possibilities for more fluid and equal relationship between Mayan men and women. Rigoberta's mother had a traditional notion of Guatemalan indigenous womanhood, in some respect passing her female ancestors' traditions to her family. However, when it came to organizing into the collective struggle, she had a different, more militant and innovative approach. Catchcall allowed Menchú and her mother to eliminate paternalistic dynamics when defending against the state violence. Menchú explains the lessons taught by her mother. She said, "My child, we must organize. It's not something I demand of you because I'm your mother. It's your duty to put into practice what you know. The days of paternalism, of saying, poor girl, she doesn't know anything, are over. My mother made no distinction between the men's struggle and the women's struggle." This has an affinity with the traditional revolutionary notion of national liberation to which all Latin American socialists of the 21st century subscribe. However, Menchu's political practice is not only a commitment to revolutionary egalitarianism, because it also draws on the autonomous indigenous cultural values of community and self-sufficiency. Rigoberta Menchú, an Indian woman in Guatemala, as a decolonial feminist text, also accounts for the multiple forms of women's participation in significant aspects of communal life as a means of fighting the racist political structure in Guatemala. Reproductive labor is crucial to this resistance. Reproductive labor raises an economic questions. How can we understand its type of productivity given that it's outside commodity production? The indigenous life world of Mayan communities is outside capital exchange and menaced by it. Understanding indigenous women's reproductive labor requires an account of communal life in contemporary Guatemala. Gladys Sulzul indicates that contemporary indigenous communities is not a life world that is essentialist and closed, afraid of contamination by external forces, nor it is archaic structure from the past. It is a malleable structure that women and men regulate, govern, and defend from present-day challenges. Women are not individuals floating freely through time and space, self-made without anyone's help. Rather, we are and we exist in communal weaving, says Sulzul. Using this weaving metaphor, Mayan feminist philosophy also connects with other threads of knowledge, particularly the Italian autonomist feminist tradition. For example, Silvia Federici emphasizes the continuity brutality of the treatment of women and racialized populations, and something that is intrinsic to modern world and its economic values. Sulzul writes about the connection of indigenous reproductive labors to Federici's ideas. Italian autonomist feminist thought places domestic collective life at the center of an analysis in which the concrete experiences of daily life are political charged. These viewpoints makes the places and ways that indigenous women fight visible. This perspective represents a modification of the early Orthodox socialist tradition because women do not find liberation after the victory of anti-capitalist revolution. Rather, the concrete experiences of today, sustaining community through on-wage practice, have their own profound value. This is partly because of the dimension of care and the priority of self-interest, but also because of the deep affinity of women's traditional labor with reproductive logic of the non-human ecological world. Menchu's testimony shows how the racist and political state machine dominates females' bodies, labor exploitation, sexual violence, and murder, but also how these bodies have positive resignifications, creating meaningful connections with the earth. The earth is the center of indigenous communal life, and women's fertility is connected with the life of their land and community. Territorial possession, its harvest, and giving birth are intertwined since they contribute to multiply life for Menchu's community. Girls learn the lesson to organize and reproduce life on the land and their bodies from an early age. The testimony tells, girls are valued because they are part of the earth, which give us maize, beans, plants, and everything we live on. The earth is like a mother which multiplies life. So the girl child will multiply the life of our generations and our ancestors whom we must respect. In addition, Menchus views the land as a symbolic site that creates solidarity among Guatemalan women, surpassing race and class. In one chapter, she reflects on the multiple categories of women in Guatemala, working class, peasants, poor, Ladino. Ladino is a very Guatemalan term that means mestiza women, bourgeois women, and middle class, and how all of them, especially indigenous women, have an intimate and dialogical relationship with the earth. As for other Central American feminists and activists, national liberation is not primarily a product of European descendants people, but neither it is a purely indigenous project. Indigenous values have the potential to reshape the nation as a whole in a manner that can include all the people of the country, whatever their ethnicity. It is obvious that Menchu's position is more subaltern, much less privileged than other Central American figures, like white Nicaraguan poet Yoconda Belli and other mestiza poets. For example, Menchu's comments on the lack of sex education in Guatemala, as well as her sacrificing the desire for a romantic partner for her people. This is very different from the more pleasurable experience of the body described by other Central American women writers. However, Menchu's body has different intense experiences, drawing from her indigenous culture's deep affinity with nature. Menchu has a rich vocabulary to recognize identity with nature. She refers not only to the Mayan female stoicism and resilience expressed by Suzu's concept desire to live, but also to the dualism and human-animal body through Nahualism. For the Mayans, people are born with a Nahual, a protective animal spirit that accompanies them over the course of the life and bonds with their personality. There is an entire chapter on the notion of the Nahuals in Menchu's testimonies. As Caroline Forno points out, Nahual, as a person-constitutive trait and foundational element of Quichen identity, is part of a broader worldview that positions the coexistence of the humans and the animals with a shared ecology. Menchu's accounts of the Nahual dialogue with Eduardo Viverios de Castro description of Amerindian indigenous worldviews and praxis. Contrary to Western philosophical traditions that emphasizes individual souls or minds, considered as superior to the body and independent from nature, indigenous communities emphasize the multiplicity of bodies and assert that human shares one soul with different species in a socio-political continuum. And in Menchu's testimonies, the animals from her community are also the victims of the same violence and suffering from the effects of the Mayan genocide, which give an expansion of the phenomenon as an ecocide war. She recalls, they kill our animal, they kill many of our dogs. To us, killing an animal is like killing a person. We care for all the things of the natural world very much, and killing our dogs wound us very deeply. Menchu testimonies capture the Mayan approach to death as a process that requires individual and communal preparation. The person who is going to die knows his or her coffin beforehand, transmits knowledge to the most beloved person, and after that, the community participates in the death ceremony and take care of all the expenses. This idea of the community participating in death is one of the activities under the concept of catch-call, communal service work mentioned by Suzu. He described it as the communal work of containing pain, and it refers to all the labor force that is mobilized to organize mourning, funerals, paperwork to rescue bodies in the morgues, to organize the repatriation of migrants who die in the United States. The concept of death for Mayans from an accepted process shared collectively radically changed when it was confronted by the systematic killings and massacres during the war. It is also the reason why Menchu and other members of her community joined the fight against the state's violence. She explains, I quote, "Killing someone's death lived by others is something we feel very deeply. We felt it in our own flesh. For us, killing is something monstrous. And that's why we felt so angered by all the repression. Even more than that, our dedication to the struggle is a reaction against it, against all the suffering we endure. Sul describes Mayan women, particularly Ixchil, as the front lines in the difficult war of death by organizing burials, looking for the deaths and searching for justice against the war violence done by the state. The organization of Ixchil women publicly testifying to the mass murders committed by death squads sent former President Efraín Ríos Montt to trial in 2013. Unfortunately, because of structural corruption and impunity, Ríos Montt was not found guilty. Nevertheless, sending a genocidal president to trial positioned Mayan women as important subjects to rebuild the wounded communities. In Menchu's case, although she mentions in her testimony that her father was a bigger influence on her political activism than her mother, she acknowledges the strength of her mother dealing with the pain of death in her family, particularly her siblings. Menchu says, I quote, "My father was very tender and always protect me, but it was my mother who coped with the big problems in our family." Menchu is a gifted, extraordinary political thinker. However, she's not entirely exceptional figures emerging isolated for her milieu, but rather rooted in the historical and social experiences of Indigenous women in Central America. Moreover, she does not only record the experience of the largely defeated national liberation struggle of the late 20th century. Rather, she also points forward towards new strategies of 21st century decolonization, defending the land from despoilment and dispossession of its people by extractivist projects, organizing by states and multinational corporations. For example, in 2016, Berta Cáceres sacrificed her life in the struggle to protect the Lencan women, men, and ecology of Honduras. Like Menchu, Cáceres was inspired by women's traditional familial labor, by indigenous traditions of care and embeddedness in nature, and by a spirit of courageous defiance of the state. I believe that new social movements will take inspirations and values from the concept elaborated by Central American socialist feminists like Rigoberta Menchu. They point forward to new strategies from which we can learn to mitigate 21st century challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really awesome. I gotta do my emojis. Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Argüello. That was really interesting. And I have a lot of questions, and I'm just so fascinated at like this continued, conversation about, Menchu that has, spanned decades now, right, within feminist circles. So I want to open it up and see if anyone has questions that you would like to pose to our guest speaker tonight. You can also write them in the chat if that's easier. If you're, on your phone or whatnot, feel free to write it directly to myself or to everyone. And I'm happy to facilitate that as well. Let's see if anyone has anything to say. So to start us off, I have several questions, so I'll just do one to get us going. I'm curious if you're in communication with Menchu, since she's still very active and very involved. And as someone who's new to TCU, I love that last picture. I did not know that she was here in 2018. That's amazing. So yeah, I'm just curious if is she actively part of this project? Is this something that you communicate about with her?
Yes, thank you, Crystal. That's a great question. I want to comment a brief anecdote about the picture. I stepped on Menchu's feet, and that was very painful. And I felt really bad about it, but I was very pregnant, 8 months when the picture happened. So when I stepped on her feet, she she saw me and then she rubbed my belly and blessed me. So I felt that was really nice of her. And unfortunately, I have not I feel a little bit shy about the idea of contacting her. I know that she's active on Facebook, and that's probably something that I should do. I'm really interested to contact also Gladys Ursul, because it's like the new generations of feminists, of Mayan feminists. So yes, I don't know why I feel probably more prone to contact Gladys than Menchu, but I don't know, I feel a little bit shy.
No, I completely understand. And, I mean, we often all write about, not all, but some of us write about these, big names or these very, impressive people or people who have been instrumental, right? Or in the things that they do that have really shaped, our understanding of the world or shaped our understanding of, activism, right? So I wasn't suggesting that you needed to, I was just curious. See if there's other questions. So in terms of, I'm going to ask another question since we're doing this. I was also really struck in your talk, this sort of way of talking about that desire to live, right? That voluntad de vida versus, as resistance to the necropolitics, right? Within Guatemala, within, I mean, many, many countries, right? Particularly something that Indigenous women are facing and trying to fight against. So I was curious, in your work, is that something that, you're writing directly against? Is this something, that you're exploring in terms of that connection of body and earth and resistance and community versus that sociopolitical necropolitics?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question. Definitely, like the one question that I always ask myself, and I ask to my students when we study Menchu, is like, how is it possible that you can keep living after a genocide, right? And this could be connected to other contexts too, like the Holocaust, or like in Africa too, right? So in Rwanda, so how can women keep going after, a very traumatic experience? And one of the things that I really like about Menchu, or even Menchu through Gladys Ursul's eyes, is like community is what the social force that move them. So for one hand, of course, you have the necropolitics. The state wants, the racist Guatemalan state wants to kill you because you are Mayan and because you are a woman, but then you have these communal networks that exist and that have existed and are more sophisticated than the mestizos networks that exist in Guatemala. So it's really interesting that through the communal work is what helps them contain pain and makes visible their struggles. So I think that that's a very interesting lesson that we can learn, right? To how we, on one hand, like care labor, reproductive labor that is happening in the private is not private, it's public, it's politics too. But on the other hand, protecting land is really important. Is there where the practices are happening. So I just feel very motivated to see this connection of nature and the daily practices that become political, that we can learn, the spirituality, right? That we can also see in the Mayan women, but also other movements in the US, for example, too.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'm going to pause on my questions and ensure that there's space for others to speak.
Tatiana, I was wondering if you wanted to talk about any of the comparative analysis that we've done with Black feminism, intersectionality, Black Lives Matter, or with Chicana feminism and Ansel Dua, or with feminist economics. I know that's a lot, but any of those things, if you wanted to talk about any of those connections.
Yes, I can start, and I feel very happy that here I see some people that works with Chicano feminism, like Nino Testa, Andrew too, with economics too, with also Black Lives Matter. So please help me, and I will try to say some connections. Like we can say that in terms of Black Lives Matter, which is a feminist movement, one aspect that is connected with Menchu is the aspect of spirituality. As Laris Couleur said, like fighting for someone's life is a spiritual fight, and also the mourning for people who are killed by police violence. In the case of Black Lives Matter, is very similar with the mourning of issue women killing that are trying to bring justice because of the militaristic state apparatus, right? Then, if we think about economics, we think, for example, the aspect that contrary to heterodox economics, in which they say that you have like the modes of productions, right? And you have other systems that overlap, in this case, the private life. Men choose dialogues with ideas such as Federici, because she says that the capitalism is destroying forms of livings that are not wage, that goes beyond production, but are as important to sustain life, right? And another aspect that I want to come, the Chicano feminism, well, I will ask some help to Nino and you, Andrew, but I briefly could say that with Ansaldúa, for Ansaldúa, there's an importance, of course, of race, sexuality, but ecology is really important, right? As similarly to Menchú and to Suzhou. And of course, she talks about the idea of, she's influenced by Aztec philosophy or Mexican philosophy, and she brings in her writings images of female goddess that are anthropocentric, like what's the name? Culialique, something like that. Can you help me?
Yeah. Coatlicue is the goddess that Ansaldúa talks about. Yeah.
Yes, and she presents this dualism between male and female through the figure of Coatlicue, and she criticized that within the Aztec system, governed system, that there's a patriarchalism, right? And she criticizes it, but at the same time, she takes figures from their spirituality to put in dialogue as a mestiza Chicana woman, right? So I don't know if that helps, but I don't know if Nino or you, Andrew, wants to comment more on it, of the connections or disconnections.
I have, but please, Andrew, if you have anything you want to add. I just had a question, actually, which is, I'm really, thank you so much for the talk. It was really wonderful to get to hear in more detail after, reading about your research, get to hear about it in more detail. I'm really interested in, particularly like it gets within your title, the idea of this being an instructive kind of philosophy, right? And, tracing a history of praxis, of feminist praxis and history of ideas through, not just one figure, but like, you're kind of tracing back, generations, right? Many generations. And I'm wondering how you think about the instructive part of that, like how to think about like what to learn from and apply in terms of that praxis that you're tracing, that isn't like a way of thinking about it that isn't consumptive or colonial, or isn't like just taking it, but like how if we aren't, if we don't identify as Indigenous, right? As I do not, what are the ways to think about the application piece? Because application seems really important to what you're arguing here.
Absolutely. Yes, that's a great question. A great question. I think that one idea is like we need to, and I say that I have some of my students here too. So I think that it's really important to value like people that do not have formal academic formation as real subjects of history, and to value their work, to try to make changes in history. And I think that Rigoberta Menchú, as an Indigenous woman who's very smart and a leader, right? But who does not have the category boxes of being formally educated, right? She presents us to the idea of like, I'm subject of, I'm subject of justice in my country, right? That would be one idea. Another idea is to get closer to nature, right? The idea that we see land is really important, and protecting land, protecting the common is what makes us be able to keep practicing, right? Our way of knowledges. Like if we think about Federici's idea that the witches were the first ones who were like hunted, we can see that Menchu and her mother could be considered like witches, right? Because they were protecting knowledges, but it's intrinsically connected with the land, right? And the last, I don't know, instructive example is thinking that reproductive labor is that, as Federici says, is that invisible work that is so important for moving societies, right? So I always tell my students, think about your success in TCU depends of having clean clothes, having like food in your house, right? So all the things that are important to sustaining life are things that are happening in daily practices. So I think that it's important to think in the private space, and how is the connection between the private and the community, right? And yes, small acts that keep help, especially in the pandemic, right?
Yeah, oh my God, yes, this is a very good question. I enjoyed that. I see Carol has her hand up, and then Lisa.
Tatiana, I wanted to thank you for a really great set of concepts and connections that I'm now making. You know, it's valuable, and it's invaluable actually. And I think what I'm connecting and what I'm feeling like is that some of the sort of public personal spaces like Facebook, I see a lot of women, mostly women, but not always, demonstrating the impulse to do pain work and to narrate death. And I see it with humans during COVID. I've seen it with animal deaths, with companion animal deaths, with in different websites where people are really alarmed about extinction. And you've just given me a gift tonight, introducing this wonderful feminist thinker, because it's in sort of embodying it in a virtual way for me now, as I've been reading these posts and trying to do my own sort of virtual sociology. But I wanted to thank you, and especially for the ideas of how women create this memory work, and how women survive and bring together the community after these atrocious events. So thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you. I can send you the Gladys Sul does not write a lot in English, but she has an article. So if you're interested on the desire to live, I will send it. It's a short article, but very illuminating.
Thank you.
Sure.
Lisa, please go ahead.
Tatiana, thank you for a really interesting talk in so many different ways. So I, of course, am always thinking about these things through the lens of anthropology. I think, we can't get away from our own trainings, right? And I'm thinking about, in particular, the work of Faith Warner, who is a medical anthropologist and has done a lot of work with K'che refugees who have been displaced from Guatemala and who have been resettled in refugee camps, predominantly in Mexico. And I'm intrigued by the connections that you're making between identity and land, and gender and land. Warner talks a lot about how these displacements exacerbate existing inequalities, and that women end up, when they are relocated away from indigenous lands and indigenous spaces, and in particular, the ability to regulate and craft the space of communities, right? They come in and they're coming into a regulatory apparatus that's making assumptions about gender and family and how people are organized in space. And it really ends up disenfranchising women as they are displaced. And I'm wondering if you can speak about whether you see parallels in the work that you are doing among displacement and land and gender, and whether that, how that impacts power and the flow of power.
Oh, good question. Good question. Oh, well, it's interesting because of course there's it's a great question. It makes me think. I think that of course there's like a migration from communities, indigenous communities that are within Guatemala, right, to the city, and that's have referred. I have seen some testimonies of people, right, moving there that refers to the idea of, we can say, cholification. Cholification, I don't know if you, the idea of becoming more Ladino, more mestizo, and that means like there's like a strong division between the Guatemala City, and there's a lack of communication between the people who lives in the highlands, in the rural areas, in their own communal lands, and the people in the city. So in many cases, that refers to the eliminating language, right? Mayan, 22 varieties of Mayans, but the government does not have like a strong policies defending Mayan languages. So that's one idea. Another idea is like becoming Ladino, right? Cholification, becoming mestizo, and eliminating the roots. So definitely the way to preserve identity is through the social relations that exist in the land. And that's reminding, Lisa, that I want to comment a little bit how gender dynamics works in this land, because someone could ask me, like, is this essentially, I mean, how does that work in comparison with mestizos areas, right? And one idea is that they are more, their relationship is ambivalent. The people who lives in this land could be more, there's like patriarchal kinships through the family, like the land is given to the paternal last name. But it's really interesting that, and through marriage, right? So that's really, it could be problematic. It could be seen as, what is the word, as sexist in a way. However, it's really interesting, like the configuration of families is more progressive than in the mestizo society. So you have what Claudia called algebra of families. So you have the nuclear family who lives in this land. You have the grandparents who live there with their grandchildren. You have different reconfiguration that makes that people who are connected with this land like more inclusive, and everybody participate, even the kids helps in the land. So there's it's more inclusive than what we can think about people living in Guatemala City, for example.
Andrew, I see that you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say more about how our research responds to the question of displacement that Lisa asked, because one of the things that we work on is this question that, like, yeah, there's a process where commonly Indigenous people, when they're pushed off their land, they lose their relationship to the ecology, they lose their relationship to the Nagual, and there's this kind of almost cultural death. But the question is, like, how much of that is irreversible versus how much of that is something that could be restored or something that could be recreated in a new environment. And so Berta Cáceres is a really interesting example in Honduras, because she grew up thinking of herself as more of a mestiza, but she reestablished a relationship with the Lenca community. And other people have done that in Honduras. There are people who maybe they were forced out, they were moved to the cities, they grew up, they felt like they had to give up their language, they had to only speak Spanish. But there are other people who are re-indigenizing, like that. That is also possible. And then that's also kind of the big question of that's raised by Anzaldúa, is also the way that somebody who grew up really outside Indigenous society completely for generations could still, through exegesis and through philosophical thought and through things like that. So somebody like Anzaldúa is never going to fully become an Indigenous person again, and there's some controversy about. But on the other hand, you can recreate, you can carry certain Indigenous values with you into like mestiza society or mestizo society.
Yes, and you remind me, thank you, Andrew. You remind me that this idea that you're saying, also you can see it in other countries like Chile, for example, with the Mapuches. like Mapuches are basically urban communities, and they have this idea of the Mapuche, the historic land, and they are producing it through teaching Mapudungun to their kids in the city. So it's true, like, yeah, that's a great perspective. There's also, in some cases, this idea through literature, through knowledge, sharing this and creating an imagined idea of your nation without having the land. You're right. Yes, and there is a question here by Rob. I appreciate the way you integrate feminism to think about the role of communal labor and is even connected with Langer colonial patriarchy. What economic things have been helpful to you in thinking about communal care labor? Economic thinkers, interesting. Well, I don't know if Federici could be considered like an economic thinker, but definitely like the idea of Federici that the primitive accumulation is something that is an ongoing process, and that is basically, and you can see different mutations, and it's happening from it's happening through in Africa and in Latin America through extractivist projects, right? So that's an idea that someone like Federici takes to, and the idea of these big, how do you say, this lack of valuing on unpaid labor, right? And the importance that unpaid labor has to reproduce life, but at the same time is this is like a menace, is menaced by the state, right? So I think that Federici, and mostly Susul is a sociologist, but through the eyes of Susul, I read Federici, and I read Federici through the eyes of Susul.
Yeah, Tatiana, well, we're also trying to learn more about J.K. Gibson Graham and about other fields that come from heterodox economics. But we were actually wondering, because that particular field is sort of a little bit more new to us. We were actually wondering, Rob, if you could say more about economic approaches that you've seen that speak more about indigenous and like colonial experiences and how that affects, I mean, that question about communal labor.
Yes,
and if you have any suggestions of things for us to read, we would love it, basically.
Yes, yes, definitely. And I would like to know if you know about feminist economists that are thinking about the way of care as a social practice that goes, that is connected, that becomes like a policy, you know, like human rights, or if you can guide us about feminist economists that deal with this idea of care as a social practice. That, yes.
It was right. I will also share that as a sociologist, but with, you know, as an interdisciplinary person, I got a little bit involved with the International Association for Feminist Economists a while ago, and your work was actually making me think of Dr. Charushila's work on, I mean, it's a different space and place, but it, you know, really focusing on post-colonial economies and this sort of like, you know, relationship between, you know, gender, identity, what gets called development, right? Land, and this idea of women's, you know, unrecognized labor, disregard for labor, a misunderstanding of the work that, you know, that women do, particularly in indigenous communities, as, you know, essential to the maintenance, right, of the very lifeblood of those communities. So, you know, I know this isn't necessarily a space and place where we're, you know, building on thought, but you've gotten me very excited for the chance to continue to speak and learn from each other. I see we have one hand up and we have a couple minutes left. So I will say, Mariana, why don't you offer us our last question for the evening?
Wow, thank you. Hi, Dr. Argüello. So I remember learning about Guatemala and about Menchu in your course. And I know you talked a bit in your presentation about certain traditions that she emphasizes in her work. I just wanted to ask if she's ever talked about the story of La Llorona, and if she's ever kind of brought that into her analysis of what happened in Guatemala and with her people.
Not in the testimony, right? That would be great, but you brought into light the fact that people are taking the empowerment of Mayan indigenous women, resignifying the Llorona myth. And actually, Mariana went to a conference, in a virtual conference in Mexico, and she talks about this movie that is called La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, and how that is a movie from 2019 and talks about how to rethink the genocides through the myth and through contemporary representation of the myth. So Menchú doesn't talk like that, doesn't talk on her testimony, but more contemporary artists, in this case, Jairo Bustamante, is resignifying that. And actually Menchú appears in the trials, right? Of I don't know if you remember, there's like a sort of cameo, or looks like a cameo of Menchú during the trials. I don't know if you want to comment, Mariana, briefly about the movie, or what do you learn from this movie about Mayan women?
Yeah, of course. It was extremely influential in terms of, like you were saying, bringing the genocide into a new light and kind of redefining what it meant, and giving the power back to the Mayan people. So it was no longer like a disenfranchisement of the story, but it was really making sure that they had a position to speak, and they had a position to kind of not only take revenge, but also take back the story of what had happened during the genocide. And it was very masterfully done. And the visuals of it are really enticing, in terms of the way that the La Llorona herself is portrayed, and then the kind of metaphor that they use in terms of the primary character that you follow along the movie, and how he represents kind of the government of Guatemala. So yeah, it was a really great fusion of the two.
Thanks. Thank you.
Any additional questions, comments, accolades? Well, I would just like to say again, thank you so much, Dr. Argüello, for coming and sharing your amazing work with us. I'm very excited for your piece to come out. Did you say it was under review with Hypatia?
Yes, exactly. So I hope we will hear this year, hopefully.
Yes, I'm very excited, and do let us know, and we will share the information among our TCU WGST network. Dr. Camp, thank you for also joining us and continuing to build feminist community in TCU, but also just here in the area. Did you want to say? I saw you leaned forward. Feel free.
Yes, I was just about to type it into the chat, but just to say thank you so much, Tatiana, for, from my perspective, continuing the work and yet just taking it to a whole new realm that I think we couldn't have imagined when I got going.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Tatiana, thank you for an amazing talk on Indigenous feminisms and land and body and the instructive nature that we need to incorporate into our praxis. So thank you, everyone, for coming. I'll stay on for a moment while everyone pops off, but I hope you have a very lovely evening. And thank you again.